Oh, wow.
I've, I've,
That's a,
yeah,
did you
I've been
just
in the
go out
West
there
like
for
15
school
years.
and work, or had you
I,
always wanted to go to Wyoming?
I came out West initially to work for the BLM actually in California. And then one thing led to another and I wanted to go to grad school in Wyoming. So it's kind of a long story.
Oh, fantastic. Wow. That is excellent. And it looks like it's turned out well for you there. So are
Yeah,
you
yeah, I've enjoyed it.
in Laramie then, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice. I had some friends who lived up there, and and I used to visit periodically. It's a cool town. People don't know. Laramie's pretty hip, actually. At least the downtown core of Laramie. I've walked
It's a
it.
really
It seems
nice
kind
small
of hip.
town. I mean, it's one of the only affordable small towns in the Rocky Mountains, I think, that you can still buy stuff in. But it is nice. I mean, it's super accessible to fishing and hunting and hiking and everything. That's kind of the draw, I think. It is brutally cold in the winter, though.
Yeah, yeah. It's a testament to how much I loved my friends who lived there that I visited Wyoming in the dead of winter and even drove up from Salt Lake City to go and hang out with them. And that was a white knuckling it, the wind blowing the snow across the highway, trucks on their side off the highway, just going, I'm not gonna make it. This is insane. How do people live up here? So
Yeah, it's the
uh,
most closed stretch of interstate in the country for a
oh
reason.
my gosh, terrifying, terrifying. But yeah, survive that, you can survive anything. So,
Yeah.
well, with that, we're right about at 4 o'clock, and I see Taylor has opened up to our participants to join us, and we're live streaming on Facebook. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm Liz Perry, Crow Canyon's president and CEO. Really excited to be moderating today. And before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I'll just start with some of our usual opening slides. Crow Canyon, if you don't already know about us, and sometimes we get some new folks, we're a nonprofit research and education center here in Southwest Colorado near Mesa Verde National Park. As you get into the talk today, if you have questions, you can pop them in the Q&A at any time. I really do try to get to all of them. We had a very long webinar last week and I didn't get to all of them, but try not to put them in the chat because it's much harder to find them there. If Zoom gives you a headache, we are live streaming on Facebook, and this and our past webinars will be on our YouTube channel. If you have not subscribed, please go ahead and sign up. I'd like to move on to our land acknowledgement. Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Jicarilla Apache people on whose traditional homelands our campus sits. With the work that we're doing here at Crow Canyon, we seek to bring light into the darkness of memory that these lands, waters, wildlife, and her descendants hold because of policies of removal, genocide, and displacement. And we seek paths that support and align with Indigenous people and communities. With huge gratitude, we honor the contributions of present-day Indigenous communities, descendants, and the colleagues with whom we partner, who have helped guide our work and mission and guide it today. So thank you very much to our Indigenous partners, and we're so grateful to live and work here. We have, if you want to expand your relationship with Crow Canyon beyond our webinar series, we do have some amazing travel programs coming up this year. This fall, still plenty of room to sign up on our Glen Canyon program, which is kind of part 2 of one we did last year that was incredible. So you actually be out on the water on these trips. The Bears Ears, Miles, Smiles, and Textiles, a very textile-focused trip into the Bears Ears this year. And the Hugum to Oodom trip in November, so down in southern Arizona. So if you want some more information about this, feel free to email any of us or check out our website at crowcanyon.org. Our upcoming webinars the next couple of weeks. Just a huge shout out to, if people don't know, Taylor Hasbrook, who is in charge of our webinar program and is behind the scenes and asks for no recognition and deserves all the recognition for coming up with some of these incredible speakers, like our speaker today and our speakers next week, Indigenous Archaeology through Consensus and Collaboration with Dr. Aguilar. And then the week after that, we have Scarlett McCaws, uh, and Aztlan tradition of West Mexico with Dr. Mike Mathiowicz, who is an amazing scholar and speaker if you don't know him. So just a huge thank you, as we do every week, and it is deserved every week, that this is an entirely free webinar program, and it is made possible by you. In fact, really almost everything that we do at Crow Canyon is based on your donations and generosity and philanthropy to Crow Canyon and our mission. And this webinar series in particular. And I just want to say, when you all sign up and register, and you make a gift, when you register, it pops up in my inbox, and I get to look at it, and it makes my day every day. So thank you so much to everyone for your generosity in helping to keep our programs possible. And our intrepid fundraisers have found a new way to contribute to the mission here at Crow Canyon. If you have a crappy car, or a car you don't want to deal with anymore, or bother selling, you can now donate your vehicle to Crow Canyon. So if you have any questions about this, you can reach out to us, and you can also call the number on your screen here and follow this link, and you can pop your phone camera up and against this QR code as well. So if you have an old car that you want to get rid of, consider us. So without further ado, I'm extremely honored to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Spencer Pelton is the Wyoming State Archaeologist and is also an adjunct professor of anthropology at the University of Wyoming. He began his career in archaeology in the southern Appalachians of East Tennessee, but made his career in the Intermountain West since 2009. He has been an archaeologist in Wyoming for 11 years, receiving his master's from Colorado State University in 2013, his PhD from the University of Wyoming in 2018, and became the state archaeologist in 2019. Spencer maintains research interests in all aspects of high plains and Rocky Mountains archaeology, from its earliest human occupants to the immigrant trails. Spencer lives in Laramie with his wife and daughter, where he likes to play music and fish and enjoy all of the amenities of that part of Wyoming. So thank you so much for joining us, Spencer. Really excited to hear your talk.
Thanks for having me, Liz and Taylor. This is great. Let me go ahead and get my screen shared here. Okay, everybody see that? Can I get a thumbs up, Liz, maybe?
Oh, yes, looks
All right,
perfect.
Okay, I published a study with a bunch of people earlier this year about some bone needles from this really early archaeological site in Wyoming called the Prele site. And so Crow Canyon asked me to come and talk about that. What I decided to do is contextualize it, sort of the larger world of clothing production in the Pleistocene, from its origins in the old world all the way over to the new world. And so I'm going to dive right into that. I got my PhD at the University of Wyoming a few years ago, and I really went there because I was interested in approaching the archaeological record from this perspective, human behavioral ecology. Todd Survell was there, Bob Kelly was there, some other folks, and it was just the place to go to do that. And a lot of human behavioral ecologists focus on these ideas of optimal foraging models. So how many animals should you cull from the landscape given a certain environmental scenario? How long should you forage in a patch of berries or on a mountaintop with a mountain sheep population before you should move on to the next patch? Those sorts of things. It basically gives you an optimal way to obtain calories and get them in your body in a really theoretical sense. What I realized after working with this stuff a little bit was that it's not just about getting calories in your body. It's also about keeping those calories in your body once they're there. When we're exposed to extreme temperatures, our bodies work really, really hard to maintain some semblance of thermal stasis. We shiver and we burn calories. We do all sorts of stuff. That starts happening around 25 degrees Celsius. Below temperatures about 25 degrees, your basal metabolic rate starts to kick into high gear. And the further it gets below 25 degrees, the harder your basal metabolic rate has to work to stay in a thermoneutral state so that you don't get hypothermia and die, basically. And then once you get down to 10.5 degrees Celsius, this is a pretty average number, plus or minus maybe a half a degree Celsius globally. Humans require technology to thermoregulate their bodies. Their bodies just can't cope with that anymore. So that's really the framework that I approached this question through a long time ago now, almost a decade. So when we talk about human thermoregulation, it's really two main ways we do that. We do it through our physiology, and we do it through technology and behavior. Uh, Humans are adapted to very warm environments. We all evolved in sub-Saharan Africa. We're not really meant to be living well, in Wyoming, for instance, where it's currently blizzarding outside my window. So a lot of our thermoregulatory adaptations are catered towards warm environments, like sweating. Our body proportions are kind of long and lean compared to other primates, and that's thought to be an adaptation to these hot tropical environments. But we do have some cold adaptations as well. We have this stuff called brown fat or brown adipose tissue that is basically just burns calories when we get cold and heats up our body. It's this pretty miraculous tissue, part of our endocrine system. We also shiver. Everyone's familiar with that. Shivering is an involuntary response that just contracts your muscles really quickly, and it provides some amount of heat to raise your basal metabolic rate. We also have body hair as well that helps bolster against cold environments. So when I was first looking into this, I was like, well, there's got to be places in the world where you can be naked and homeless forever. And sure enough, there are. So the contours on this world map right here, everything north or south of the red lines, those are areas in which you're going to need to start thinking about wearing clothes. But within those red lines, you could survive without clothing. And it's probably what our earliest hominid ancestors did until pretty recently in the past. So if you did decide, though, to go north of that red line, you're going to need to start doing some technologies. You're going to start needing to modify your behavior and the things that you make to protect yourself against these cold environments. So we know that archaic hominins, for instance, start making heavy use of caves. Caves are kind of famously the same temperature all year round. They're like 52 degrees or whatever. So if you could hole up in a cave, you can probably survive some of these ice age conditions by just simply modifying your mobility system to focus on caves. But eventually, you have to start actually investing in some pretty sophisticated technologies. And really, those come down to a few major things. Housing is a big one. Freestanding houses that are not bound to cave systems. Fire is one, although it is probably initially controlled for dietary reasons as opposed to thermoregulatory ones. Bedding is probably one, blankets and floor coverings, things like that. And then of those, clothing is probably, in my opinion, I would have this opinion though, it's probably the most important. It's just what allowed us to spread to basically every corner of the globe and do it really successfully. I wanted to contextualize this a little bit because there's a lot of debate around this stuff, so take it with a grain of salt. But in my reading, really the first permanent modern human occupations outside of Africa are places where clothing isn't needed. People didn't leave Africa and go straight to Lake Baikal in Siberia, right? It looks like they actually made it around the Indian Ocean into places like the Philippines and northern Australia. And some of the earliest evidence for modern humans outside of Africa are in the places you would expect, given this model. These are places where humans didn't have to invent clothing to spread out of Africa. But after a while, these sites date to 65, 70,000 years old. After a while, humans decide they need to go somewhere else and start spreading north of those areas where they need to use clothing to survive. And that's really what this talks about. So I'm going to give you a pretty quick and dirty overview of this whole topic. There's a lot of stuff to talk about, but I'm going to start with evidence for clothing production. How do we actually know that people are doing this stuff in the archaeological record? And then I want to talk a little bit about some spatio-temporal patterns of this stuff. When and where does evidence for clothing production actually emerge in the globe? And how does it get to the New World? And then finally, we'll conclude with this case study from the Prele site, talking about how people at Prele were making clothing almost 13,000 years ago in Wyoming. There's probably a lot of archaeologists on this, and you've probably never found an article of clothing in an archaeological site. Maybe some of you have. If you have, good for you. That's pretty lucky. I know sometimes you find things like yucca sandals, and here in Wyoming, there's been a couple moccasins found. But in general, clothing is an extremely rare thing to find in the archaeological record because it's perishable. It goes away. You can't bury it in a floodplain and expect it to last for 13,000 years for archaeologists to come and excavate it later. So we largely depend upon indirect evidence for clothing to string this story together about where clothing emerged and how it was constructed once it did emerge. Uh, Really, one of the first things is just physiological constraints. There's some very early archaeological sites in the world that people simply couldn't have made had they not been wearing clothes. And I think the most striking example of this I've featured here on the left. This is the Yana rhino horn site, way up in the northern reaches of Siberia in Russia. It's north of the 70th parallel. And this site dates to 35,000 years ago. This is a very old Upper Paleolithic site, one of the oldest in Siberia, in fact. And at this site, this is not just a little transient camp. There's all the evidence you need really to suggest that people were living at these latitudes permanently at this time, 35,000 years ago, and they simply couldn't have done that without having clothes. So I think we can assume that people at the Yana site were wearing clothes. Additionally, there's bone needles there, which we'll get into later. But beyond that, features and artifacts are our next line of evidence. And occasionally we get pretty lucky and we run into a feature that has good evidence for clothing. Really, the earliest example of this in my mind is the Sungir burials in Russia that date to about 32,000 years ago. This is a pair of burials. When they excavated them, they were just covered in beads and all the other sorts of adornments, very likely that were attached to the garments that they were buried in all that long time ago. But they kind of made this nice artist reconstruction about what garments those people might have been wearing when they were interred 32,000 years ago. But I think beyond that, really the most common line of evidence that archaeologists have for clothing production is the tools themselves. They're just everywhere if you know where to look. And that's what I want to go into now. How do we actually know where people are making clothes? Well, making clothing is a really complicated process, and it starts way back really from hunting, targeting animals that make for good clothing. But I'm going to provide an overview of what that process looks like and what the tools are associated with that process here. So really the first process after you strip the hide off the back of an animal you killed is defleshing that hide. And that really just boils down to using this thing called a flesher. There's an example in this image on the right there, that bone that's been kind of notched in one end. You can take those, you can work that end of a bone underneath strips of flesh on the underside of these hides, and by working that bone underneath there, clean that hide of extraneous flesh from taking it off the back of an animal. You can also do this with a stone knife or a flake or something as well. So once you have that done, what the next step you might want to do is dehair the hide. You don't want to do this for everything, but say if you're using it to make a shirt, something with a buckskin, and you don't want to have like itchy hair on it, you don't want to, or you want to like limit the weight of the piece of leather, and you dehair it. And really you just do that by either taking a really sharp flake and stripping that hair off the outside of the hide, or you can do a process called slipping the hair, which is basically just soaking the hide and then pulling the hair out one handful at a time. Once this is done, you stake the hide out, you let it dry for a little bit. People I've talked to said you want to do this when the sun is soft is the term. Basically when the sun is low in the sky, so that you don't run the risk of the hide drying out too much and cracking. So you dry the hide out for a few days. Then you take that hide and you start scraping it. The purpose of scraping is to decrease the thickness of that dermal tissue, which decreases the weight. It makes it more pliable. It makes it lighter. And you do this with an end scraper. This is really a ubiquitous tool type on the Northern Plains and Rocky Mountains. It's really found everywhere. These things started being made a really long time ago in the global sense. They're these things right here on the slide in the bottom center. Those things are probably almost always hafted into a handle, say like a piece of antler or a piece of wood. And then to use these, there's a perception that you would use these like a planer, pushing it away from you. But to use these, you actually more effectively, you pull them back towards you. And every time you pull it back towards you, you release a strip of dry hide, and it gradually makes that hide thinner and thinner and more pliable until you have a nice hide that you can move on to the next step. Oftentimes, the next step in this process is called graining. This is really just a process of breaking down the collagen in the hide to make the hide more pliable. In the old world, sometimes people associate this process with like cancellous bones that have been split in half. So you have that nice, rough, cancellous bone on the inside of, say, like the femur of a bison or something, and you can rub that on the hide to loosen up all the fibers. This tool here in this image from the Agate Basin site was argued to be a grainer. This is just a calcite concretion, basically. It's got all these little crystals on the back of it. And when you look at those crystals really closely, there's all sorts of evidence that it was used to rub against hide. Probably, rubbing that really vigorously into the underside of the hide to loosen it up and make it more pliable. And then finally, if you're going to turn this hide into a piece of clothing, you can stop at this process really at any time to make like a blanket, for instance, or make like a floor covering for the inside of your house to cut down on conductive exchange of heat between your body and the ground. But if you want to turn this into a piece of clothing, you really need to get soft, supple leather. And so this last process of tanning is really what does that. It softens the hide. Occasionally it adds some water protection or some proofing against degradation. This is done in a lot of different ways across the world, but in the Paleolithic record, it seems to be pretty closely associated with red ochre use. People have suggested that red ochre has some antiseptic properties, so maybe you rub this into your hide to prevent insects from burrowing into it or laying eggs in it. People have also suggested it has some waterproofing qualities, which I would believe, having worked with it quite a bit. A lot of this ochre has like a really fine grain texture to it that would provide some nice waterproofing. It could also just be cool looking. It's red paint. And if you want your clothes to look cool and be red, that's what you need to put into it, or all of the above. That hide in the places necessary to actually sew it. You do that using something like an awl, either a stone awl or a bone awl. You could use a graver, which is this little tiny artifact right here labeled as D. You prepare that seam, and then the final step is to join all those seams together with a bone needle, which you see an example of right here. You could probably perforate some of these with the needle itself, but it's unlikely that happened a lot. I think you'd want to prepare these seams with some sort of perforator before you sew with this bone needle, simply because you would break a lot of needles if you tried to perforate these things with a needle itself. So I had all this kind of theoretically in my mind, and I was fortunate enough to join Todd Surville in Mongolia. I don't know if he's given a talk on that in this session, but it's a really cool project. And one of my goals over there was to document how people produced and repaired clothing in a mobile context. These are the Doha. They ride reindeers around. They live a pretty mobile lifestyle. And lo and behold, they use a lot of the same tools that we find in the archaeological record from 13,000 years ago. They have inscrapers. This is like my favorite piece of material culture from our Doha camp. It's like a piece of wood with an angled piece of metal at the end, bound to it, basically hafted to it with some metal rings. And they used it to scrape the insides of hide, taking off these big piles of dermal tissue in the process. They also used awls, one of which had two in one end for for expediting the process of perforating seams to prepare for sewing. Needles, thimbles. This is an image actually of somebody dehairing a piece of reindeer hide. He just took a empty vodka bottle, sat on a log on the outskirts of camp, broke it at his feet, and then started stripping the hair off the outside of this hide with the glass shards from the vodka bottle. And it would dull, he'd throw it out, pick up another piece and do it again. This is technically Paleolithic technology, right? It's a silicate. These are basically chipstone flakes. And so this is kind of where I started thinking maybe chipstone flakes were a good thing to use for dehairing. And then lastly, they made this really cool, basically a grainer in camp. There's this down log, they cut this notch in it, cut this handle out, and then you could pass a hide through underneath this handle and just kind of wrench down on the hide over and over again. And every time you do that, the hide would get a little more pliable, a little looser, and a little more towards turning the hide into a blanket or a piece of clothing or something. So in general, I left with the impression that, wow, this stuff hasn't really changed that much. I mean, now obviously we buy our clothing from stores. They're made in factories and big industrial settings, but until 100 years ago, people were basically using the same sorts of tools to make and repair clothing as they were 40,000 years ago, more or less. Okay, so that's a suite of tools used to make clothing, but there's one thing I stumbled on doing research for this that I became convinced was a really good line of evidence for clothing production, and I think hopefully I'll convince you of that by the end of this talk. And that's prey choice, the bones that you find in an archaeological site. So human behavioral ecology is accustomed to thinking of prey choices as solely as a function of caloric yield. That means that all things equal, you should target big animals because they have a really big payout. Um, you get more calories per time spent hunting an elk or a bison or something like that than you do trapping rabbits all day. It's just pretty simple math. However, thermoregulation expects that maybe you should also consider the thermal properties of the skins of these animals that you're hunting. So you're obviously getting a lot of meat and fat out of these animals, but that might maybe what if that's not the only thing people are targeting animals for? What if they're also targeting animals specifically for the thermal properties of their skins? And when I started looking into the ethnographic record of this stuff, sure enough, people did this a lot, especially fur bearers like lagomorphs, hares and rabbits, predators like cats, foxes, coyotes, and wolves, mustelids, but also birds, which was a surprising thing to me. In Arctic regions among the Inuit, birds are oftentimes targeted specifically for their skin. They weren't plucked and like stuffed into a pillow, but they were actually skinned and sewn into garments. And this example in the upper right on this slide is a really interesting one from an Inuit group that lived on an island in the Hudson Bay. They really depended on caribou to make their clothing. And one winter, the caribou all died because of a freak ice storm event. So after that, they just started making all their clothing out of bird skin. They'd set up these traps, collect eider ducks and other sorts of really warm birds. They'd sew the entirety of their garments, pants, shoes, parkas, gloves, everything out of bird skin, and make these awesome bird, like big bird suits, which you see there in that photo. Probably extraordinarily warm. Probably took a lot of birds, a lot of sewing, but when it came down to it, uh, birds are what kept them warm and living in this really extreme environment. And I would wager if you excavated one of those archaeological sites, you'd find a lot of bird bone, where before you might have found a lot of caribou. So the bones of these animals are expected where clothing production occurs in a campsite. It's not necessarily expected for subsistence purposes, though, because if you got bison at your disposal, you got mammoths, other things, you're probably not going to spend all day trapping rabbit just for the meat that it provides. So when does this stuff happen? Well, for the vast majority of hominid history, it's pretty boring. Scrapers do emerge really early in the archaeological record. They're in Oldowan and Acheulean assemblages in Africa. Obviously, Middle Paleolithic assemblages created by Neanderthals in Eurasia are full of scrapers with evidence that they were used to scrape hide. But for a really long time, for almost a couple million years, the suite of technologies available to us to thermoregulate against the environment were pretty simple. You have fire, some evidence that fire emerges maybe 1.5 million years ago. You have really good evidence for controlled use of fire in Israel, like 750,000 years ago. People start modifying, or I should say hominins start modifying caves and rock shelters maybe 70 to 80,000 years ago, kind of like not building freestanding structures, but building like lean-tos against shelters to help get out of the wind. But really, it doesn't get interesting until modern humans get on the scene. And the Upper Paleolithic in Eurasia, specifically in Eurasia, uh, sees just this huge fluorescence of technologies associated with clothing production right when modern humans colonize that continent out of Africa. This is when you see the first bone awls, first bone needles. It's when you see the first warm-skinned species, these fur-bearing animals. It's when you see the first freestanding houses, hide tanning tools. Everything just seems to happen there, and it seems to happen right alongside modern humans. So it's looking at this big picture from all the way back, it seems like archaic hominins like Neanderthals, Denisovans, all the ancestor, all these archaic hominins that are all over Africa and Eurasia, they probably did use some hide products that required some simple scraping and perforating. You can imagine them scraping a hide to use as a blanket or like a shawl, maybe putting hide down on the floor of a cave to serve as basically like a sleeping pad. Perhaps they're joined around the neck with a little stick or something, but pretty simple stuff. On the other hand, modern humans came into Eurasia with the technologies to make clothing, true clothing that's fitted, parka-like garments, where the sleeves are sewed to custom fit to humans. We have fringe on hoods, or you have fringe around sleeves. Actual things that allowed them to be out in this really cold Pleistocene environment for a really long time of the year, foraging and surviving in some really extreme environments. So it was that process of humans entering Eurasia about 40,000 years ago, slowly making their way up through the Eurasian continent, north to northeast, that eventually led to them colonizing the New World via the Bering Land Bridge. And by the time they reached the Bering Land Bridge, like they've had like 20,000 years to develop these technologies, so they're probably pretty good at it. And so by the time they enter North America, they have all the technologies necessary to survive in basically every environment in the Western Hemisphere. And sure enough, when you look in the archaeological record of the earliest sites in North America, you see evidence for clothing production everywhere. This is another graph from my dissertation work. This is a bunch of Folsom sites where I compiled artifact presence, absence, and counts data from these Folsom sites all the way from North Dakota down into Texas. And on the left side of this graph, I have just your typical suite of tools that you find in these sites. So choppers and points and bifaces, that kind of thing. And on the right, I segregated the tools in blue that are most heavily associated with clothing production or thermoregulation. So ochre and end scrapers, gravers, hearths, bone needles, grainers, and houses. The stats bear this out, but there is a significant difference in that these things within the Folsom Range between North Dakota and Texas, they're a lot more common in sites at the northern end or high altitude places within the Folsom Range than, say, down in the Texas Panhandle or Central Texas. So these technologies associated with clothing production pattern the ways you would expect. People are doing more of it in colder places. In particular, I want to point out the warm-skinned species. This is not something that people typically have talked about in the Folsom record, because you go in these Folsom sites, they're 12 to 13,000 years old. They're just full of bison bone. Oftentimes, they're just piles of bison bone. In the midst of all that, you'll find like one fox bone or one snowshoe hare bone or one bobcat bone. And it gets reported, but when you actually pull all that information together, you start to realize that, wow, a lot of these sites actually have evidence for these warm-skinned species. 35% of Folsom sites contain some sort of fur-bearing carnivore, like coyotes and foxes and swift foxes, things like that. And even more surprising to me is 73% of these contain lagomorphs, so hares or rabbits. It's actually the second most common animal to find in a Folsom site next to bison. I think for a long time, at least I had assumed that a lot of this rabbit bone had just like ended up in the sites incidentally. They do like to burrow into archaeological sites, but I think with numbers that big, we have to start really seriously considering that these are part of the occupations, that these were actually brought into the sites, in my opinion, to make clothing. So that's kind of the big picture of the Folsom stuff. But then when you really look at the stone toolkits and what comprises the stone toolkits, you start to see that those too are patterned in the ways you'd expect of people making clothing in cold environments. This is a really simple analysis. I basically just I added up the end scrapers and gravers in each of these stone tool assemblages. These are kind of, in my opinion, two of the most unambiguous and like common artifact types found in stone toolkits on the plains that are associated with clothing production. And lo and behold, we got this great relationship where the colder you get, you got mean annual temperature on the x-axis, percent clothing production tools on the y-axis. The colder you get, the more of these stone tool kits are comprised of clothing production tools, the more end scrapers and gravers you have. So this one in Sweetwater County, Wyoming, way up high elevation, 50% of the tools from that site are end scrapers or gravers. Indian Creek, way up in Montana, super cold up there, 45%. But then in Texas, at the Deadbird Freakin site, you got nothing. Or Shifting Sands, Blackwater Draw, you only got like 15% of the stone tools down there. So again, it patterned out exactly how I'd expect. The interesting thing about this analysis is that if you run a regression line through these data points, not this one, but a least squares regression, it intercepts the x-axis right at 25 degrees Celsius, which, if you remember, that's right at the temperature that humans need to start investing in hide production and clothing production, based on our physiological tolerances. I don't think that that's a coincidence. I actually think that these artifacts are patterning really well with human physiology here. Now, I will note that for every degree Celsius decrease across the plains, you'd expect a 0.8% increase in scrapers and gravers. Obviously, there's a lot of variation to this, but it's kind of an interesting phenomenon. So, more than anything, I think bone needles bear this pattern out, which is what we're really going to focus on for the rest of this. This is a map I modified from Alan Osborne, so thank you, Alan. He's really been pretty pioneering in the study of bone needles in North America. In general, bone needles are a lot more common to find in cold or high latitude regions of North America than warm or low latitude regions. All the red dots on here are places where bone needles have been found in the contiguous US. And if you notice, Wyoming has an embarrassment of riches when it comes to bone needles. We got 5 sites, which is a lot. And if you count Lindenmeyer, which I do, it's only like a few miles south of the Wyoming border. I'm going to rope that one in too and say we got 6 solid sites where we have bone needles in Paleo-Indian contexts in Wyoming. And right in the middle of that distribution, kind of right in the middle of the state, we have the Prele site, which is what I'll talk about now. I don't know, but I strongly suspect that this crowd has heard a lot about Prele, so I'm not going to do an exhaustive overview of the site. This is a nice drone photo of the site facing roughly northwest. It's an early Paleo-Indian mammoth kill and campsite. It's buried about 10 to 15 feet within alluvial deposits on a terrace of Prele Creek in eastern Wyoming. This is one block. This is block D, which I'll talk about a lot more later. But the site really extends. I don't know if you all can see my cursor, but it's really all over this landform right here. It's a really large site. It's currently the oldest site in Wyoming that we know about 12,900 calibrated years BP. This is a pretty new map from a recent publication that you might not have seen before. At the close of excavations last summer, we actually finished last summer at this site. We established that the site was about 4,500 square meters, pretty big. What we got, here we go. So what we ended up doing to find the edge of the site was using a bunch of auger tests. So every single one of these little black dots here is an auger test. We screened that through window mesh, found tiny little flakes and pieces of bone and ochre. And through that, we're able to chase the Prele site out to a much greater extent than we had previously acknowledged it had. So you see down here in the southwest, we got blocks A, B, C, and D. This was really the core of our excavations for like a decade at the site. Block A being a mammoth bone bed, and block B being this ochre stain, block C being this kind of frankly boring scatter of brown chert, and block D being like a really phenomenal concentration of stone tools and fluted points and bone needles and all sorts of stuff. I call it the master suite because it seems to be where the wealthiest of the Prele people lived. But we also last summer, it's not on the map, but we placed a block over this major concentration up here in the north end of the site. I called that the Rock Springs block because we found some chipstone raw materials there from like the Rock Springs area of southwest Wyoming. It ended up being a really massive site, and a lot of the site contains evidence for clothing production in 3 of these 5 areas that we excavated, blocks B, D, and E up here way in the north. So bone needles are certainly part of that story, but there's also all the other stuff I've already talked about. A lot of end scrapers, at least 16 end scrapers we found at this site from blocks B, D, and E. Block D itself contains 14 of these things. This is a nice sample of them right here in the upper central part of the slide. These things are exactly what you'd expect. They're classic end scrapers. They're probably hafted in bone or antler handles. They were used to process hide. And the ends of them have pretty classic signs of being used on dry hide. They're just classic examples of processing dry hide with end scrapers. Also found perforators, which another thing that you'd expect with sewing, both a pretty big one and a really tiny little graver here, but both of which probably used to perforate hide. Found a ton of ochre. If we're to accept that ochre is part of the hide tanning process, they probably were doing a lot of this. Blocks B, D, and E all had ochre in them. But block B was really, it's been widely discussed in the literature already. It has this huge stain in it. Maybe people were staining ochre inside a house here. We don't really know. And then I did want to point out this inscraper from block E. It's just completely covered and stained with ochre. This is a pattern that's been noted at other sites. The Lindenmeyer site, my colleagues Jason LaBelle and Cody Newton, they found that a lot of the inscrapers from Lindenmeyer had that as well. And it makes sense. If ochre is part of the hide tanning process, scrapers are part of the hide scraping process. You put some ochre on, you scrape it a little, put some ochre on, scrape it a little, and you just do that over and over again. You end up with a lot of ochre staining your inscrapers. But most excitingly, we found close to 40 fragments of bone needles throughout the site that represent at least 7 bone needles and preforms. 2 of those came from block B, way up here around that ochre stain. You can see them numbered here, 1 and 2. We got 2 needles and 2 preforms from block D. You can see them numbered down here, how they are with relation to the larger scatter of chipstone artifacts in this block. And then we found one last summer in block E, which is not pictured. We haven't analyzed that bone needle yet. These are reconstructions of the bone needles, by the way. We were kind of lost on doing these until we actually got into the weeds and did some of the analysis we did for this paper. And this is probably about how they would look reconstructed. So we had these bone needles. We wanted to know what they were made out of. Nobody had ever answered this question. And it's just a really baseline, simple thing that we really needed to know. It's traditionally been assumed that these things are made from the bones that are commonly found in sites of this age. So bison and mammoth. That's what you find in early Paleo-Indian sites in Wyoming over and over again. And it also stems from one or two paragraphs in the Agate Basin monograph that George Frison wrote way back in the early 80s. They found this worked bison scapula. It looked like it had been grooved and snapped a bunch, and there was all these incisions on it. So, and there was also found in direct association with some bone needles. So Frison said the close association between these things suggested that the former were being manufactured from the later. Without the intermediate stages between the initial grooving and the finished product, the actual use of bison scapula for fulsome needle manufacture is speculative but highly probable. So ever since then, I think people have just kind of assumed that that's what these things were made out of. And that's what we assumed that they were made out of as well until we started getting into the weeds of this stuff. Unfortunately, these bone needles are just way too small to identify. Not only are they small, but they've been heavily worked. And so any of these like classic zooarchaeological landmarks you use to analyze this stuff are just not present on. So we turned to a couple novel methods. First, we used zooarchaeology by mass spec to identify the species. We also used a micro CT scanner to obtain some idea of what bone, what elements these things might have been made out of. So here's the results. The Zoom's results identified 3 families of animals that these things are made out of. One of the block B needles from that ochre stain is made out of felid bone. It's either a bobcat, a lynx, a mountain lion, or an American cheetah-like cat. The Zoom's method just doesn't have the resolution necessary to parse those out. A bone needle from block B, the second one from block B, and then one of the bone needles from block D were produced from canid bone, specifically red fox. And then 1 needle and 2 needle preforms from block D as well were produced from hare. That in Wyoming, that's either a snowshoe hare or it's one of the 2 species of jackrabbit that we have in the state. The micro CT scanning suggested that these things were made out of metapodials, or the foot bones of these animals. These needles are really small. They're a mean width of about 1.5 millimeters. That's pretty similar to what needles are today that are made out of metal. And when we measured all this out, we found out that the long bones and metapodials of canids, felids, and hares are basically the right dimensions and shape for these things. You can't make a needle out of, say, like a felid pelvis. It's just not the right shape. And you can't really do it out of a rib either because it's too curved. And you can't do it out of a cranium because it's just too bumpy and weird. But the long bones and the metapodials are just right for this. And between those two, the metric dimensions are most similar to metapodials, to the foot bones. So if you took a metapodial of any of these animals, so from either foot in canids and felids, but specifically from the metatarsals, the foot bones of hares, which are much longer than the metacarpals, if you just take those, you incise a couple lines down them, you smash it, and then you braid it down, you got a bone needle. They're already basically the same. The cortical bone thickness is basically the same dimensions of bone needles already. So you don't have to be whittling down, say, a mammoth femur or a bison tibia into a tiny bone needle. You can just turn one of these tiny bones into one instead. So the implications of this, when I got to thinking about it, I got really excited by, because I had these two really defined expectations for what thermoregulation, clothing production should look like. Two of these expectations were bone needles, got to have those, but also these fur-bearing warm skin species. And here we had the convergence of those two expectations in individual artifacts. We had bone needles made out of fur-bearing carnivores and lagomorphs. The use of the metapodials, combined with the absence of other elements from these animals in the site, suggests to me that these bones came into the site attached to furs. This is a really common way to skin animals still today. The little tiny bones in the feet of these fur bearers are just too small to kind of get the fur over. So you strip the hide down to the feet, you lop off the feet, and you keep them attached to the fur. You even see this on really expensive furs sold on eBay, which is what this is. Still have the feet attached to it. So it's a good way to explain why we have foot bones from these animals, but nothing else. We don't have bobcat skulls. We don't have fox rib cage or anything like that. It's just the foot bones. I think it's because those things were coming into the site attached to furs. And by extension, I think it's really solid evidence that people were trapping at this time. And this is not a huge surprise. We think people were trapping as far back as maybe 30,000, 40,000 years ago in the old world, but it's not really been something that's been discussed too much for the early Paleo-Indian record of North America, because I think primarily because, it's dominated by these mammoth kills and giant bison kills. And it's such a auspicious aspect of the archaeological record that trapping has just never really occurred to us. But if you want to obtain really good furs for making clothing, trapping is the way to do that. You can imagine doing a big mammal hunt. You sit on that thing for a couple of weeks to jerk the meat and process the hides. But while you're doing that, the kids and maybe elderly people that just weren't physically capable yet, or no longer capable of doing some of this arduous manual labor, could run trap lines and just make little routes away from camp, come back every now and then with a rabbit or a fox, and make a really useful contribution to this Paleolithic society. So to conclude, clothing production had to have been an integral part of human survival beginning at least 40,000 years ago. And really, it's why modern humans were able to colonize the world. We would not have been able to colonize Siberia or even Western Europe or Scandinavia, any places like this, had we not developed clothing to cope with those climates. Because of that, because all these technologies evolved and came into human societies really early in the modern human global dispersal, they brought that stuff with them into North America upon colonization. I won't get into that. Probably around 14,000 years ago, though, and south of the ice sheets around 13,000 years ago. And when you look at the early Paleo-Indian record with kind of a critical eye or primed to find this stuff, you kind of see it everywhere. These end scrapers, these perforators, bone needles, grainers, ochre, all this stuff is probably associated with clothing production. And in a lot of sites, it dominates the stone tool assemblages. Projectile points have traditionally become kind of the most, or traditionally been one of the more interesting and aspects of these assemblages and the things that get the most attention. But I have to think that in a lot of these sites, the majority of the stone tools in these assemblages are directly related to clothing production as opposed to subsistence. All that evidence seems to correlate really well with temperature, so you get more evidence for clothing production at high latitudes and high altitudes. And of the sites that have yielded evidence for this, I do think that Prele has yielded some of the best evidence that we've yet found in the Western Hemisphere for this stuff. I mean, we basically have every step of this process from beginning to end, from obtaining furs, obtaining hides, turning those things into pliable leather through scraping and tanning, sewing those things into garments. We have the whole sequence there, and you just don't really get that in many places. And then finally, this clothing was almost undoubtedly used with fur-bearing animals, likely as components of larger garments that used more traditional leathers from, say, like bison. So you can imagine these garments having fringes of fox fur or bobcat fur. Maybe there's gloves and hats involved in the clothing as well. I think it's the clearest depiction that I can think of what this clothing might have looked like nearly 13,000 years ago in Wyoming. I'll wrap up, but I did want to acknowledge at the least my co-authors, because this was a pretty big collaborative project. McKenna Latinsky and Sarah Lawn can take credit for doing all the zooms analysis, actually figuring out what these animals were. And Todd Servo is the one that really developed those protocols for Wyoming. Michael Buckley was the one that invented zooms. He contributed to this study. Todd Schoberg and Jack Govert run the micro CT at the University of Wyoming. Then Madeline Mackey, Robert Kelly, Matt O'Brien, co-PIs for a while, and then Matt G. Hill and Paul Sanders also made some great contributions. You can see some other ones there, but with that, I'll wrap it up and take some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Spencer. That was fascinating. And the Q&A is filled with questions. I'm gonna choose some for you, but I'm gonna go ahead and start with a nice general one that's kind of about you too. That what made you so interested in the topic that you chose to pursue it professionally?
Yeah, I mean, like I said at the beginning of the talk, I felt like it was a big missing picture, and then I spent like 2 winters in Laramie, and I was like, yeah, this is definitely a big missing part of the story. I mean, it's just you live in really cold environments, and it starts giving you a great understanding of the nuances of how to keep warm in very cold places. And the reality is that like a lot of places are, I mean, even Laramie today, right? Like if there wasn't centralized power grids in Laramie, I don't think anybody lived here. It's just so brutally cold. So it was really a combination of kind of being primed to think about it and then moving to like, one of the coldest places in the lower 48.
That makes sense to me. Absolutely. Here's one from one of our archaeologist friends. Has there been any experimental archaeology that reproduces the tools associated with clothing that helps support the idea that these tools were directly tied to clothing manufacture?
I've done some. I've done like a couple posters on it, which I know it's like a classic grad student move. You do all this research and then do a poster and then never do anything. But I did a lot of experiments with inscrapers early in my PhD education. We actually went to the extent of like we'd scrape systematically, weigh the detritus, tracked the dulling of the inscraper. We did a bunch of nerdy stuff, but I mean, all that convinced me basically that inscrapers were always hafted. When you find inscrapers, they're invariably associated with dry hide scraping, in my opinion. You don't one valuable lesson from that is you don't scrape wet hide with inscrapers, which I've seen reported in the literature. It's just it tears holes in it immediately. So I actually spent like the first 2 hunting seasons in Laramie. I befriended the processing shop, and they would let me climb in their dumpster and pull out animal hides from the dumpster from like pronghorn and elk and deer. And so I ended up processing a lot of hides with inscrapers, and then also with perforators. That's how I kind of came on that idea. McKenna, I should mention, as part of her dissertation, she's experimenting with producing bone needles from different bones as well, just to see, could you make bone needles out of other stuff? But yeah, we've done a lot of experiments. Unfortunately, like experiments are really fun to do, but I just never end up publishing them because they're just fun. It's like what you do with your buddies on the weekends, like drink beer and experiment with Paleolithic technologies. But all that kind of convinced me that of the ideas I presented here, basically.
Thank you. So this is a question that we often get at Crook Canyon, and it's really important to us, which is, in your work, did you have any collaboration or engagement with Indigenous people, descendant communities And if so, kind of what did you learn, or what were their thoughts? And do you think that that there's interest about this, meaningful interest from descendants or indigenous communities with this kind of work on clothing?
Yeah, I mean, the work in Mongolia was that the group we were with lives in a very similar environment to what Wyoming would have been like during the late Pleistocene, and Todd, I think, zeroed in on that region for that very reason, was that pretty similar environmental constraints. So that was really the big component of that. The living people component was living with them for a couple months, helping scrape hide and tan hide, and like learning all the process of how you do it in these traditional ways in a modern context where people are still doing this stuff.
Yeah, I want to give a sort of a comment from one of the viewers that suggested that indigenous communities in Alaska and northern Canada might have some similar tools and practices. Is that anything you've run into?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, well, I think you can actually find like YouTube videos of people in Alaska doing this stuff now. But when I was doing this research, the ethnographic literature was just full of these identical tools and identical techniques. And a lot of the techniques I stepped through in that portion that came straight out of ethnographic literature in Alaska.
Cool. Yeah. This is sort of a fun one to throw in after that, which is, has taking this deep dive into the origins of clothing making impacted your own personal style of dressing and your habits at all?
I don't know, maybe I started layering more. When I first moved to Wyoming, I just had like a giant parka, and since then I'll do like 4 layers of clothing instead of one giant parka. Maybe that was a result of studying this stuff. I'm also a lot more conscientious about, like, when I go camping, um like keeping my body off of the ground, because that's a big source of heat loss when you're asleep, is if you don't have a sleeping pad, you lose more heat than you'd expect in that way. uh I think more so it changed my eating habits. I mean, when you're struggling to thermoregulate, you're just burning through calories like crazy. So that's why we eat really fatty, like butter heavy foods, for instance, in the winter, or bacon, that kind of thing. I think it makes a big difference, like if you eat super fatty foods when it's really cold out, like you kind of like fueling a metabolic engine. So yeah.
That's really interesting. Really cool. Thanks. That's a great answer. Here's one kind of tied into climate change a bit. Do you expect to find remnants or clothing scraps more frequently with the melting of permafrost and glaciers and ice patches? And if that's the case, is there a particular region that one might focus on?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, there's certainly been scraps of clothing, or like moccasins or leather found in ice patches. I couldn't tell you where. I think mostly in the Yukon. I don't know. I've seen them pop up. Um, in terms of permafrost, I guess I'd be pretty surprised if permafrost survived, but it's possible. I mean, you get those complete bison and mammoth carcasses coming out of that stuff. It would be pretty crazy if there was like a human came out of Siberian permafrost that still had soft tissues attached to it. I don't have a great answer for that though, and I don't know if anybody's actually proactively looking at that. I don't know if there's a whole lot of opportunity for that stuff in the Western Hemisphere, but maybe the Russians could prioritize that. They've been pretty busy lately, but maybe they could go up and start looking for that stuff.
Right. We all read about Otzi, right, in graduate school, and but haven't seen anything like that in a while.
No, I think it's super rare. I mean, the number of things that have to come together to make that happen are just so extraordinarily unlikely that I think it's going to be pretty rare before something else like that pops up.
Yeah. So kind of getting a little technical into the artifacts, some folks who aren't as familiar with scrapers and the concept, we've got 2 scraper questions that I'm going to lump. One of our listeners wondering kind of what size and shape are the stone chipped scrapers, and someone else asking a clarification around what's an end scraper as opposed to other kinds of scrapers. So maybe you could do a quick scraper tutorial for us.
No, it's funny. Well, I guess y'all are in the Southwest too, and there's not that many down there because it's hot. But basically, I don't know, they're like that big. They start out sometimes like that. Can you see my hands? I don't know.
Yeah,
All right,
absolutely.
so they start out like maybe that big, and they're serially resharpened down and down and down and down and down and down as they get dull. And then you typically find the ones that are thrown out. Basically, they're one of the most common artifacts globally in Paleolithic context, but anywhere that people were using hides a lot for clothing or shelter. But by the time you get down far into like Mexico, for instance, south of the naked and homeless contour, you don't really find them that much. And when you do find them, people assume that they're Paleolithic, that they're old, because
Right.
after that, climate basically warmed up. That contour moved north, and people just didn't process hides anymore. You probably didn't have herds of large game in the quantities like you did in the Pleistocene either. So these are basically, they're just really steeply retouched flakes where it's just the perfect size, about like that, to haft into a handle and start scraping dermal tissue off the back of it. It is a good question though, and it's funny when you look at it on a global scale, like you don't find them at all, like south of, say, like central Mexico, but they pick up again really far south where temperatures get colder again. And same thing in the old world. You don't find a ton of them like in sub-Saharan Africa, but up in Siberia and like Western Europe, they're all over the place.
Right. Oh, that's great. Little explanation on scrapers. So I don't know anything about tanning, and we have a question around tanning. Uh, about something called, is there evidence of brain tanning? I don't know what that is, but the person observes that that would require knowledge of plants and tannins from tree bark. Can you tell us anything about tanning?
Yeah, at least in the historic era, like in the ethnographic historic era on the plains, brain tanning was like the most common way to tan hide. So you kill an animal, you'd strip its hide off, and you'd actually use the brain of that animal mixed with some fats and waters. You'd rub it into the underside of the hide, fold the hide up, and then basically let it ferment for a while. And that would break down all those dermal tissues and make the hide a lot more pliable and soft. So I think on the Great Plains, at least, I don't know how common this was in other regions, but that was like the single most common way to tan a hide. There's something about the chemistry of the biochemistry of brains that really lent itself well to doing this. I can't describe to you what it is exactly. It's not done that way everywhere though. So like I helped tan a hide in Mongolia, for instance, and it was a mixture of like fat, flour, and water. I suspect the fat probably has something to do with breaking those tissues down. I feel like as bacteria digest that fat, maybe it digests some of the tissues in the hide along with it. But that's how they did it. They mix up this fat and flour and water and rub it into the hide, fold it up, tie it off, and then just let it sit for weeks and let it do its thing.
Fantastic. Wow, that's fascinating. So here's kind of a big picture question that's sort of fun. You've, because of the environmental conditions and the cold, you've really talked about kind of the functional aspects of clothing. And one of our viewers asks, do we have any indicators for how quickly functional clothes also became decorative, a visual show of status, or use of dyes and different types and qualities of material, kind of expanding from a functional perspective into other qualities of clothing?
Yeah, I'm super interested in adornments too. I mean, the earliest beads we have in Wyoming date to this time period, and they're we have a bead from Prele. It's made out of a hare bone that was reported somewhere else. So basically just a hair long bone that's been grooved and snapped, and there's a little bead made out of it. It could have been strung on clothing. It could have been on a necklace. But then I excavated the Powers 2 site a few years ago. This is red. It's a hematite quarry. And in that hematite quarry, there's freshwater mussel shell disc beads, which are basically one of the most like ubiquitous forms of adornment in North America after that. They're really common, just circular, basically mother of pearl beads with a hole drilled in the middle of them. So it looks to me like people had adornment immediately when they got to North America. They probably brought over these traditions from the old world or picked them up in Alaska or whatever. That being said, you don't get like the vast quantities of adornments in these sites like you do, say, during like the last 2,000 years, at least on the plains, where you just get thousands of these things in some context. But you do get obvious signs of adornment at the very outset. And so, yeah, I think we have to assume that even like the ochre use, that probably had some aesthetic qualities as well. I'm not tied to the functional thing by any means. Aesthetics have power too, right? Like we don't like to be surrounded by boring things, and it gives us a little pep step. So it's not, I think we have to assume some of these clothes were pretty cool, had beads and stuff sewn into them and were bright red. Yeah.
I love that. That's like the quote of the webinar. We don't like to be surrounded by boring things. That's absolutely true. It's funny that you mentioned the power site because we actually had a question about that. If any needles or scrapers for clothing production were found at that site.
We didn't find any needles there. We found very few end scrapers there. Powers, the lithicus image at Powers is very much biased towards weaponry and weaponry production. It looks like people were sitting on this ochre quarry, coring hematite for later and reducing big bifaces down into spear preforms and projectile points. It is actually kind of a notable pattern. Like when you actually systematically compare the lithic assemblage from Powers to Prele, it's really obvious. It's like Powers is all biface reduction, making weaponry, and then Prele is like 2 points and a bunch of end scrapers and flake tools, and very much more like domestic stuff as opposed to like hunting focused stuff.
Fantastic. Well, we're already 5 minutes over. We didn't get to all the questions, but we got to a lot of them, and you expounded on a bunch. So, folks, you can also probably reach out to Spencer there at the Wyoming State Archaeologist Office if you have follow-up questions. But I think we'll let you go. Thank you so much, Spencer. It was so great to meet you, and a really fabulous webinar, really interesting topic. Thank you so much for sharing your research.
Thank you all for the invitation. It's great.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.